Talk to Connie.
Mí mágad a caithfirlaí agus fáiltim raibh deis páirte glacu sa díospóireach seo agus tá má takeíocht tíofaíoir den pís oireachtaíoch seo go hilas go thomláin mar tugann sé sína ama don na cosintí atá ar fáil do Tenancies. I welcome this bill and I'm fully behind it in the sense of the extension of the protections to a small group of tenants. I certainly welcome that. It extends the emergency period for a further 6 months to the 12th of January for relevant persons. That's what's important. The definition of relevant persons means that this bill is very, very limited, and it's limited to those unable to pay rent due to two things: being unable to work due to contracting COVID, and two, being in receipt of a state-funded payment introduced to alleviate financial hardship brought about as a result of the pandemic. And that's welcome, but very, very restrictive. I welcome the fact that for the first time we are setting out what a deposit actually is, and that it restricts security deposits to a total of 2 months' rent. That's 1 month's rent plus 1 month's deposit, and I welcome that that includes student-specific accommodation. However, I worry about the opt-out that's there for students, and I'm asking myself, why is that opt-out there and how will it be misused? Now, I heard one of the Sinn Féin speakers earlier on saying that the explanation given to them in the briefing from the department was to facilitate foreign students who pay in advance more than a few months. That may well be, but I could see that being absolutely misused in relation to richer students with richer families who can come up with more than 1 month's rent and 1 month's deposit and ensure their accommodation in accommodation that's already priced out of the ability of most students. So perhaps you could give clarification on that, Minister, when you're in your closing speech. I also welcome the fact that what the students have and the Union of Students have canvassed for, that there's a 28 days termination notice. I welcome that. So overall, there's a rent freeze and an extended minimum notice period. I welcome all of that. It's very positive, and I think the bill is going to have the unanimous support of everybody here in the Dáil. However, we must put it in perspective and give a background to it. And so from August 2020 to June 21, that's almost a year, just 475 tenants had availed of the protection. And I think even from them, that's the figure, 475. Now, I would have thought today, Minister, we would have some analysis of why that figure is so low. It's marvellous that 475 tenants availed of it, but given the number of households renting in Ireland, and it is difficult to come on precise figures, but the CSO back in 2016 told us that there were 326,493 households were renting from either a private landlord or a voluntary body. Now, my own experience is that the figures are higher than that, and so the percentage of 475 is very, very low. In addition, the private rental sector grew from 8% of households in 2004 up to almost 20% in 2009 and rising. And so this piece of legislation will put an end to the growing practice of requiring multiple months' rent up front. And that's a permanent change to the legislation in contrast to the extension of time just to January, and I welcome that. The legislation, however, does very little to address the issues of affordability and indebtedness in the private rental sector. Now, the Minister, when he made a speech, talked about that this is the 5th bill, and he's right, and we have all agreed with him in relation to the bills before this in terms of protecting tenants. And he goes on to say that only the government recognises that 70% of landlords own just one rental property, including, as my colleague has said, a substantial number of TDs, and then 86% of landlords own just 1 or 2 rental properties. And I fully appreciate that, and I understand many landlords come into the market by accident, by inheritance, by just different events happening in their lives. But if we look at what has happened in relation to the rental market, and we look at what the Library and Research have prepared for us, they tell us that While the private rented sector in Ireland is still predominantly made up of smaller landlords, as set out by the Minister in his speech, REITs and other institutional investors have invested heavily in the Irish property market since 2014, based on government policy to encourage them to come in. In a letter to the Irish government in March 2019, the UN Rapporteur on Housing noted that 93% of all assets sold by NAMA went to foreign investors, and by 2016, 1/3 of all the properties sold in Ireland were purchased by investors. So we see a very strong trend here, all based on government policy. By the end of 2020, to come up to date, there were 15,500 residential units under the ownership of institutional landlords, and I could go on, but I won't given the limited time. So what I'm saying here, Minister, is pre-legislative scrutiny was waived with this bill, and I understand why, there's urgency to it. But if we keep waiving pre-legislative scrutiny on the important pieces of legislation that come here, it's like dealing with a jigsaw with one piece individually and not the overall picture. And so we have a major housing crisis, which is not based on the arising from the pandemic. The pandemic shone a spotlight, brought it into focus, what has happened in relation to our housing. And another speaker from Sinn Féin said that one gets bored talking about it. We've a duty, I know exactly what he means by that and what he feels, but we've a duty to articulate a different vision than what you're giving us here. Even though you have gone a long way to protecting some tenants, the number is extremely small. You accuse us of ideology on this side of the House, when all of the time it's your ideology that has led to the housing crisis, not overnight, but deliberately as a result of government policy. The worst step taken was by Fine Gael and Labour back in 2014 and 15, when you introduced HAP. And you introduced HAP as a permanent solution to the housing crisis. And that filtered down to all the local authorities, where they were told that there was no other game in town. That was the sort of language that I was listening to as a city councillor in Galway when we attempted to bring the housing crisis to the attention of a number of governments, and we were utterly ignored. And when we got our quarterly reports, and I've said this numerous times, but I can't say it often enough, from 2009 onwards, the column in relation to housing construction said suspended. So since 2009, right up to a year ago, we built no houses in Galway whatsoever in terms of social or affordable housing. And that's in a city where we have a substantial land bank if we take all the land into account. So instead of that, we're dealing piecemeal in the manner that you're dealing with the housing crisis. That's reflected in the local authorities' approach on the ground, where we don't have a master plan in Galway, and we have over 14 acres in the centre of town, Kent Station, being developed by the developer. We have the Dockland being developed by the Harbour Board. We have Dyke Road being developed in conjunction with the Land Development Agency and the City Council. We have Sandy Road, and then we have 115 acres owned by the City Council and the County Council just sitting there. And we have a major housing crisis with a task force that's sitting for over 2.5 years and have never once produced a substantial report to tell us what their opinion is in relation to the housing crisis in Galway, and more importantly, what are the solutions. We have letters going back to the department, and we have an echo chamber in relation to a housing crisis. And you know, it's utterly frustrating, but I can say that from a privileged position where I have a job and a house. How despairing is it for somebody on a waiting list, 15 solid years in Galway City Council, waiting for a house, to be told you'll get HAP or RAS or you'll get something else, but absolutely no security of tenure. That's the background to this piece of legislation today, which is positive, which is necessary, but it's simply a tiny piece of the overall picture. And Minister, I am looking forward to the day that we look at the overall picture and come up with proper solutions. And you might do us the courtesy, I don't mean it now, but generally of listening to us. We generally come up with good ideas, not just for the sake of annoying you, but of working with you, because that's why we're in here. Garmagh.